Could you ask Mr. Evans to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mr. Evans, ready to carry on?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Evans, just picking up where we left off, did anybody, as at June or July 2014, do an internal study within NHBC to see how many as-built buildings, historical buildings, contained K15 as approved by NHBC BCS or warranted by NHBC?
No.
Why is that?
It would actually be quite difficult to get that information and quite time-consuming. Our system, our document management system, doesn't record the information in terms of the makeup of the building, the different components that it's made from. As you can appreciate, a multi-storey residential building is made up of thousands of different components. So that our system doesn't stretch to that. To be able to identify those sites, it would actually entail a great number of staff sitting down and going through all of the projects we've ever looked at to identify that. And even then, that may not be accurate because we don't hold as-built drawings.
Well, we'll come back to what you did do by way of study later on. What action did the NHBC take in relation to all buildings specifying and using K15 and other combustible products in the meantime, so between July 2014 and March 2015?
So we would have been having conversations with builders in terms of the position of K15 and alerting them to the fact that we were working with them working with the manufacturer to identify the suitability of that product. So we would have been on new buildings, on buildings which were submitted after that January date, so not subject to the previous BBA certificate. Those afterwards, we would have been having those conversations, warning the builders. I think there's yeah.
Okay, going back to the last email in the chain at NHB 50730. Let's go back to that. The last email in that chain comes from Brian Martin in response to yours to him of the 11th of July. That's NHB 50732. I'm so sorry, I'm not sure I enunciated that clearly enough. 732. And he writes to you saying, "Hi Steve, many thanks for this. Can you keep me informed of any further developments, please? Regards, Brian." Were you surprised that he offered no further guidance, feedback, or even comment on what you say you had done and what you were proposing to do?
No.
Now, you sent Brian Martin's friendly warning email and your response to it on to colleagues at the LABC, didn't you?
I did, yes.
Can we go to LABC 50892, please? Sorry, 40892, I think it should be. LABC 40892. Yes. And if we look at the third email down in the chain at the bottom of page 2, we can see here is an email from Doug Basin to David Ewing and Barry Turner. And below that, we can see your email to Doug Basin and Barry Turner itself, also of the 11th of July. And underneath the opening part, it says, "Barry, Doug," you see?
I do.
"Hope that you are both well. Please keep this confidential at this time, but felt that you may like to see this approach we've had from DCLG and my response. I've mentioned this at BCA meetings in the past, but it is now coming to a head. I note that the LABC registered detail expires in August this year, so you may wish to consider this in the light of the amended BBA certificate issued in December 2013. Why did you ask them to keep it confidential?"
I don't know. I asked myself this. I saw this on previous evidence at the inquiry, and I don't know.
You don't know.
I mean, in hindsight, there was no reason to ask them to keep it confidential. I'd already discussed it with Barry and Doug at the BCA technical meetings.
Did you want him to keep it confidential because you knew that this was a massive problem and wanted to contain it as best you could? When I say this, I mean the fact that there was Kingspan K15 historically present on a wide number of buildings above 18 metres.
No, as I say, I can't. Now looking back, I can't see why I asked them to keep it confidential. I'd already discussed them with it, as I mentioned there, at BCA meetings.
Can we please go to LABC 0020141 at page 30? This is part of Doug Bason's witness statement. And at page 30, paragraph 52.4, he says, this is in response to some questions about the email, the tail end of which you can probably just about see at the top of page 30 itself, which you don't need to see. And he says this at paragraph 52.4. He, that's you, Mr. Evans, he was concerned that there may be an issue of potential non-compliance with the building regulations and spoke to us, quotes, in confidence, close quotes, as he did not wish to make the matter public knowledge until he was in full command of all the facts relating to this matter. Is that correct? Does what Mr. Bason says there reflect your thinking at the time?
As I've said, I've reflected on what I said in that email, and I don't know why I asked for it to be kept confidential. You know, in hindsight, there was no reason to keep it that way. I'd already mentioned the issue at the BCA Technical Committee, where Doug and Barry were present, so it wasn't confidential.
Did you tell the meeting, the general discussion at a BCA meeting, that, as Mr. Bason recalls it, there may be an issue of potential non-compliance with the building regulations? Did you say that?
No, I don't recall those words. I believe I appraised them of the situation with the BBA certificates, the change in the BBA certificates, and the work that Kingspan were now planning to do.
But it's right, isn't it, that there was, or may have been, an issue of potential non-compliance with the building regulations so far as K15 was concerned?
If the K15 had been used in accordance with its previous BBA certificate, as far as the building regulations are concerned, there wouldn't have been a non-compliance.
Now,
On buildings which were subject to that BBA certificate.
Now let's go to NHB 50757. This is an email run in the month before the friendly morning. This is June 2014. And if we go, please, to the first email in time on page 3 in this string, it's an email from you to Richard Bromwich at Kingspan, dated the 16th of June 2014, copied to a number of people, including John Lewis, Graham Perrier, and Ivor Meredith. Subject Kingspan K15. And it says, Dear Richard, further to the recent discussions between Kingspan and NHBC, I would be grateful if you could provide me with an update on the use of Kingspan K15 on buildings with a height exceeding 18 metres as a matter of urgency. The latest version of the BBA certificate extracted below makes it clear that only a construction similar to that tested can be considered as meeting the requirements of BS 8414 Part 1, K15 backed directly onto a masonry wall. It is noted that the additional wording of the earlier BBA certificate, whereby advice on alternative constructions could be sought from Kingspan, has now been removed. NHBC has not been provided with anything further that is based on BS 8414 Part 1 to prove performance from accredited independent testing in accordance with BR 135 recommendations. As such, as a building control body, NHBC Building Control Services is in a difficult situation. Whilst we do not wish to prejudice the construction of a large number of tall buildings in which K15 is being used as an insulant, we do not have any suitable basis under Regulation 7 for the acceptance of the external envelope design where it moves away from the construction used to compile the BBA certificate. Now, just pausing there, that accords, doesn't it, with what Ivor Meredith told the inquiry, namely that NHBC were reluctant to refuse a K15. Do you agree with that?
As I state there, it would if we had an outright ban at that point, it would prejudice the construction of a large number of tall buildings. It would actually cause other problems then with insulation. So we were keen to see, as I said, to resolve the problem, to allow, if possible, the use of this type of material to satisfy both the thermal but also the fire safety aspects of the building regulations. And this was a warning that if we weren't able to do that, then that would cause problems, yes.
So I think the answer is yes, you were reluctant to refuse K15.
At that stage, yes.
Yes, and was that reluctance on the basis that NHBC would find themselves in difficulty, as you identify, because, in part, of the large number of buildings that had previously been approved or warranted historically by NHBC before 2014?
As I've stated before, this had nothing to do with historic buildings.
Yeah, well, we've been there, Mr. Blind.
Or were continuing to approve and warrant that were proposing to use K15?
So the buildings we were finaling at this point, still in June, would still be under the previous BBA, which I've explained under what circumstances we would accept K15.
But the last part of that paragraph rather suggests that, in fact, you had come to the view that you didn't have a suitable basis on which to rely on Regulation 7 to use the BBA certificate as the route to approval.
Going forward, yes.
Right.
So for buildings which were subject to the new BBA certificate, which I'm referring to here, we would not be in a position to accept and issue a final certificate on those buildings.
And in the second line, where you say you don't wish to prejudice the construction of a large number of tall buildings, can you give us an idea of what you meant by large number?
I can't at this point, but what I can say is when we did run a report of buildings under construction in 2015, there was around 300 blocks on that report. But that was in that would be almost about 10 months later from this.
Right. And why were, I mean, you may think that we've been here before, but why was NHBC Building Control Services in a difficult position? It had no basis on which, going forward, to accept the presence of K15 over 18 metres.
It would be in a difficult position because we would be telling those builders who were building buildings subject to the new BBA that we were not able to accept K15, and they would possibly then have to revisit their designs. They would also, as I said, and then may cause issues with then achieving compliance with other parts of the building regulation. So it solved one problem but made another.
Well,
what we were trying to do was to find a solution which actually meant we could move forward with both.
A solution for your customers, but not a solution for NHBC or the building control officers working for BCS.
But at this position, we weren't yet being asked to issue final certificates on the basis of the new BBA certificate.
Forgive me, your last answer but one suggested, and in fact I think said, that the difficult position was about telling builders that you couldn't accept K15 and that they would then have all the difficulties you identified. So the difficulties aren't or weren't for NHBC. It was easy for NHBC to say no. The difficulties were for your customers. Isn't that the reality?
The difficulties would be predominantly, yes, the responsibility for compliance with the building regulations is the builders.
Yeah.
But obviously, as a building control body, my role is to, any building control body, whether it be an approved inspector or a local authority, is to work with the builder to help them to demonstrate that compliance and achieve that compliance. So I wouldn't, as a building control service, we wouldn't just tell the builder, we're not accepting it, you're on your own. We would, there would be resubmissions, there would be, re-examination of plans and that sort of thing. So yes, it's their problem and they're building the building, but obviously as a building control body, we're asked to work with them to, and indeed we have to be involved in that process so that when we come to issue our final certificate, we are in a position to be able to do so and make the statements that are made on the final certificate.
Can you just explain to me why you thought, as you've just said, that your role as building control was to help them demonstrate compliance as opposed simply to ensure that they met compliance?
So for as long as I've been in building control, both local authority and approved inspectors, it's been a collaborative process in terms of rather than, and it could be run like this, that you receive a submission from the builder and you say, no, it doesn't comply, and then he tries again, no, it doesn't comply. It's about working together to not to design the building for them, but to work with them to enable them, because I can't be involved in design, but to steer them in that direction, to steer them towards those solutions which do offer compliant solutions. So it's a building control service.
Well, presumably you could give them reasons, obviously, for refusing plans,
Yes.
designs, without telling them how to do it better.
Yeah, and you do. And then you frequently then get asked the question, well, what do you need? And builders want certainty. They would like you to tell them how to build it.
Of course.
But we can't do that. We're not, we're not allowed under the approved inspector regulations to be involved in design, and we wouldn't do that. What we may be able to do is to point them towards a range of solutions which they may want to consider from our experience, from being involved in other buildings of that type or whatever. So that's what I mean by a collaborative process.
Yeah, thank you.
In that last answer, you draw a distinction between being involved in design, on the one hand, and pointing the client towards a range of solutions they may want to reconsider on the other. What's the difference?
They choose. They choose the method they go down. They're then involved in the design. They're the ones that are designers.
That's how you've always seen the role of a BCO, is it? To help the client arrive at making a decision about their design?
As I said before, building control, whether it be a local authority or approved inspectors, private sector, as long as I've worked in them, wherever I've worked, it has been along that basis that we work with the customer. It's part of a service. It is part of the service. And as I said, we may want to compete on price and service, but we wouldn't compete on technical standards.
Now, looking at the email, going back to it, you can see that in the red, it says, therefore, I must advise you that unless additional test evidence supporting the use of K15 in constructions which differ from the BS 8414 Part 1 test can be provided before 30th of June 2014, Nhbc Building Control Services will need to reconsider its acceptance of K15 in buildings over 18 metres as fit for purpose. Now, that's in red and bold. Was it in red and bold in order to bring that point very firmly home to Kingspan?
Yes.
Yes. Did you receive additional test evidence supporting the use of K15 in constructions different from BS 8414 Part 1 before that date, 30th June 2014?
No.
Given that that is so, Mr. Evans, why did you not simply tell Brian Martin, when you responded to his friendly email of the 2nd of July, on the 11th of July, that you had given Kingspan a deadline to come up with additional supportive test evidence? They had not met the deadline, and therefore you were now actively reconsidering acceptance of K15 on buildings over 18 metres.
Because I believe from this email, Kingspan were proposing to, or they told us they'd had some tests, which they were awaiting results for, and they were proposing to engage Arabs to do a global assessment based on those reports and give us or give the industry a view on how and where Kingspan K15 could be used.
So you set them a deadline in bold and red and then didn't enforce it?
We didn't, because we considered their proposal. They came back and said they'd had some tests done for which they didn't yet have the results, and they proposed to then engage Arabs. So no, we didn't enforce that. We gave them a little bit, or what we considered at the time, a further reasonable timescale to bring that evidence forward.
And if we go up the email chain, please. Oh, sorry, I should ask you first. Did you get a reply to this email from Richard Bromwich or anybody else at Kingspan?
I believe I may have got a response from Ivor Meredith asking for that extension of time.
Right.
Or they were meeting with Aaron or something. Yeah, sorry, I don't recall.
And then if you look up the email chain at the foot of page 2, please, you can see that the next email in the string is from you to Ivor Meredith, copied internally to as well, I think, as others, and Richard Bromwich as well at Kingspan. And you say, "Dear Ivor," and then if you go to the top of page 3, you say, "Please find attached copies of recent communications that NHBC have had with DCLG in respect of the fire safety and facades. I've been keeping colleagues at the Building Control Alliance, Nhbc, and the Fire Brigade up to date with the progress of our discussions. As stated, I should say, in the communication with DCLG at our meeting on 6th of August 2014, NHBC will be looking for evidence from Kingspan that supports the use of K15 above 18 metres outside of the constraints of the current BBA certificate." Now, it looks from this that you sent him the Brian Martin friendly warning email and your 11th of July response, because you say, "I've attached copies of recent communications." Is that correct?
I believe so, yes. I believe that's the correspondence I was referring to.
What did you hope to achieve by sending Kingspan the friendly warning email from Brian Martin and your response to him?
I was hoping to impress on Kingspan that actually it wasn't just the building control community that was aware of this situation, but also MHCLG were aware of the situation, and also that we were keeping them informed of the progress.
Right. And you say there that you've been in touch with the fire brigade and keeping the fire brigade up to date. First of all, which fire brigade?
That would be London Fire Brigade.
LFB?
Yes.
We've been unable to find any evidence of those communications. Can you tell us who at the LFB were you in touch with on this subject?
That wasn't me personally. That would have been a conversation between Diane Marshall and Lindsay Seal of the Fire Engineering Group.
Lindsay Seal is the answer?
Yes.
Right.
I believe so. I mean,
Right.
that's who I understood Diane spoke to.
I just want to know exactly how much you understood. What is it that you understood Lindsay Seal was told by Diane Marshall about the NHBC's then concerns about the use of K15 above 18 metres?
My understanding of the conversation was that Diane had a conversation with Lindsay to ask if the London Fire Brigade would want to know about facades. The response, as I understood it to have back, and I'm taking this third hand, was that a facade was not considered as a part of the common area of a building, so therefore would not be considered under a consultation, a building control statutory consultation. So it was a matter for the building control body, not for London Fire Brigade at that point.
Now, paraphrasing the rest of the email chain, a meeting is arranged for the 6th of August between NHBC and Kingspan. And if we go to the top of the email chain, we can see that you write to Ivor Meredith on the 15th of August 2014. We go to the top, page 1. There it is. And we can see others are copied. Ivor, my apologies for the delay in responding. Final copy of a BCA guidance note attached, which will be on the BCA website shortly. Unfortunately, they're in the process of switching administrators, so there's been a delay in updating the site. In the meantime, is it possible to get a letter of comfort from BRE confirming the tests and the likely results, and then a follow-up letter from ARAPS explaining what they will be doing with the results? I feel this is necessary to protect all our positions, given that it could be a further 3 months before we get this resolved, and the number of buildings currently using or planning to use K15. What had Kingspan been promising from the BRE and ARAP? At the meeting of the 6th of August.
So they promised the test results. So they'd informed us that they'd undertaken 2 tests and that those test results were being prepared and that BRE were going to produce those reports. They'd also told us that they'd engaged with ARAPS for ARAPS to do a global assessment of the product and of those tests to develop a global assessment which described in what situation Kingspan K15 could be used.
Did either of those letters of comfort, BRE or ARAPS, ever materialise?
No.
Did you ever pursue them?
We pursued them here.
Beyond this?
We had a meeting with, we had a meeting both with BRE and with ARAPS in November of 2014. I can't remember specifically at the BRE meeting if we discussed these tests, because I think by that time we'd got or we'd had some results cobbled together by Kingspan.
Yeah.
But we certainly spoke to Arabs at that point about whether they'd had a conversation with Kingspan.
Right. So letters of comfort didn't materialise, but they were superseded by the two meetings you had on, as we'll come to, 25th and 27th of November. Yeah. You say, I feel this is necessary to protect all our positions. What position was it of NHBC's that you were seeking to protect?
The position was, at this point, we'd now got buildings which were subject to the new BBA certificate, which were reaching, in some stages, some advanced stages of design, so they were then considering the facade types and things like that. And we wanted, if we were going to change position, we wanted to tell builders as soon as possible that was the case, that we wouldn't be accepting K15 going forward.
And why did you feel any need to protect Kingspan's position?
This was at this point a process that we were, together, and I wanted to impress on that we had an interest in this, but also, to get their ownership of the issue as well.
And what was the number of buildings using or planning to use K15 there that you refer to?
I don't know.
Was it a large number? Substantial?
But as I said, I would imagine that this time in August, by the time we ran the report, the following March in March 2015, that was around 300 blocks. So it wouldn't be dissimilar number. It would be probably less than that, but moving towards 300, I would imagine.
And I take it that you didn't pause the use of K15 or the approval or underwriting of the use of K15 above 18 metres wide.
Sorry, can I go back and correct that? So the report that we ran in 2015 was 300 blocks, but a number of those blocks were subject to the previous BBA certificate. So I think on the 2015 report we ran, there was around about 100 blocks which were subject to the new BBA certificate. So it would be around about maybe 100 blocks, sorry.
Did you pause the use of K15 whilst you resolved this issue, or did you just continue to accept it?
We continued to communicate with builders that we had on those buildings which would be subject to the new BBA certificate. We continued to communicate with builders that we were still working with Kingspan to try and furnish ourselves with the information to make us comfortable with the use of that material going forward.
Yes, but that doesn't quite answer my question. Did you pause the use of K15 until that time, or did you continue to accept K15 until that time?
The buildings at this time, we were issuing our building control final certificates for, would have still been subject to the previous BBA certificate.
Now, can we go please next to CLG 30192253? This is an email from you to Brian Martin, 15th of August now, 2014, in which you say this: Hi Brian, NHBC have had a further meeting with Kingspan and they have confirmed that they have had 2 further tests carried out at BRE. The tests utilise Kingspan K15 in steel-framed cladding systems. The tests were carried out to BS 84141 2002, and Kingspan are encouraged by the preliminary results. Just pausing there, did you mean BS 8414 Part 1, 2002, or did you mean BS 8414 Part 2, 2005, which of course is the test relating to steel-framed cladding systems?
Again, I think that's probably a drafting error on my part.
Right, it's a mistake. Okay. It goes on that they have confirmed that the full results should be available in the next 2 months. Kingspan are then to engage Arabs to carry out a desktop assessment using the 3 sets of results for tests carried out for Kingspan K15 and provide an assessment detailing the conditions that any cladding system should provide to allow K15 to be used over 18 metres without further justification. When you say there to Brian Martin that Kingspan are encouraged by the preliminary results, what had Kingspan told you at your meeting about the 2 tests they'd carried out?
They told us they were encouraged by the results.
Any more than that?
Not at that point, no.
Right.
And we asked, as I recall, we asked for the information to support that.
Right. Did they not provide that to you at the meeting?
That's why we asked for the letter from BRE to verify that they had carried out the results and what their preliminary view of was of those results to substantiate what Kingspan was saying.
Right. And what basis had you come to understand that the full results, the phrase you use, for the tests under BS 8414 Part 2 would become available at some point over the next 2 months?
That's what Kingspan told us, and would not be uncommon in terms of what we understood the timescale for get those results would be.
I see. Now, being system tests, can you explain how you anticipated that these 2 tests, even if classified to BR135, could or would assist with all of the high-rise buildings previously clad in K15? Or was that not the point?
As I've said before, that wasn't the point. This was to look at the use of Kingspan going forward.
Right. And looking at Kingspan going forward, how did you anticipate that those 2 tests, even if classified to BR135, would assist with all of the potential external wall build-ups proposed above 18 metres under construction or approaching approval at this point?
So ARUPS, what Kingspan were asking ARUPS to do was to produce an assessment detailing the conditions, as I said in the email, that any cladding system should provide to allow K15 to be used over 80 metres without further justification. That wouldn't necessarily allow all systems to be accepted without justification, but may, for example, say that the K15 could be used with a certain type of panel, with a certain type of ventilation gap, a certain thickness of, so it would set out the parameters for which a wall construction could be accepted with K15. That was what we were led to believe.
Was it your understanding at about this time, 15th of August 2014, that ARUP had actually agreed to carry out the assessment that you describe here to Brian Martin?
We hadn't approached ARUP to confirm if they'd agreed to do it at this point, I don't believe.
No, but what was your understanding about whether ARUP had agreed with Kingspan that they would?
ARUPS were telling us that Kingspan were telling us that they'd had conversation with ARUPS to do that.
Right. So, just to be clear, Kingspan told you ARUPS had agreed to do this exercise?
Kingspan told us they were engaging ARUPS to do it. I forget the terminology they used. It's a long time ago now.
Yes, I mean, to be fair to you, your email says no more than that Kingspan are then to engage ARUPS. My question is whether you got the impression from Kingspan that ARUPS had agreed to carry out the desktop assessment using the 3 sets of results, or whether
that was certainly the impression I came away from that meeting with. Yes,
I see. And then in the next paragraph, you say the agreed timescale for this all to happen is 3 months, although we are encouraging them to get it done sooner. In the meantime, we are seeking a letter of comfort from BRE through Kingspan confirming the tests and BRE's initial view of the results they'll be issuing. We've also asked for a similar undertaking from ARUPS. We are also liaising with LABC and other BCBs through the BCA to keep them up to date with the progress being made. When was it that you'd asked for a similar undertaking from ARUPS?
At the meeting earlier in the month when they told us that they were wanting to engage ARUPS, or they were going to engage ARUPS.
No, sorry. When had you asked yourself for a similar undertaking? You say in the third line, just to be clear, we, that's Nhbc, have also asked for a similar undertaking from ARUPS. It may be my fault misunderstanding what you're writing there. Are you telling Brian Martin that you yourself had approached ARUPS to give you an undertaking, or is it that you're telling him that you had asked Kingspan?
As Kingspan.
I see. In the agreed timescale of 3 months, did the NHBC continue to sign off high-rise buildings with K15 on them?
We did, because they would have, again, and building over 18 metres takes 12 to 18 months to construct. So they would have been submitted to NHBC at this time, well before the BBA certificate was superseded. So it would still be subject to that previous BBA certificate.
So to be clear, we're still in the period of hangover, are we, from the
Yes.
old BBA certificate? Looking at the final paragraph of your email, you say this: I've also attached for your information a copy of the BCA guidance note on the use of combustible cladding materials on residential buildings, which has been produced to reinforce the requirements of the regulations and to aid industry on how they can prove compliance when proposing to use materials on buildings over 18 metres that are not materials of limited combustibility. You may have given us a hint of this already, but why was the BCA working to aid industry on how they can prove compliance when using combustible materials at height?
The BCA were highlighting the routes to demonstrate compliance. So that was the aid to industry. It was identifying the routes that they would need to follow to demonstrate compliance.
Let me pose the question the other way round. Why wasn't the BCA working to limit the use of combustible materials at height to those clearly meeting the requirements either of the linear route, if it were possible, or large-scale testing under BS 8414, parts 1 and 2, to the BR 135 criteria?
Because under the approved documents, under the building regulations, a builder can demonstrate compliance whichever way they wish to. And there are 2 linear routes defined within the approved document, but the builder can still demonstrate compliance with a desktop assessment or a fire engineered solutions. They are opportunities offered within the building regulations to demonstrate compliance. The BCA brought those together into a note and put them in within the context of what we'd be looking for where they were used to demonstrate compliance for a facade.
Let's look at one more document on this point. Can we go to CLG 100068889, please? This is the set of minutes of a meeting of the 8th of December 2014 from the BCA Technical Liaison Group. And you could see who was present. You were there, and Doug Basin was there as well as Barry Turner. You could see his name at the end of the line.
Yep.
And if we look at the second line down, we can see that you chaired it. You were in the chair.
I was elected as chair for that group, yes.
Right. Can we go to page 4, please, and look at point 12.0. Use of combustible materials in cladding systems to buildings over 18 metres. And it says, SE, that's you, Mr. Evans, outlined the work carried out to date in identifying possible solutions to allowing polyurethane-type insulation materials to be used in cladding systems over 18 metres. SE/BT, that's Barry Turner, to discuss further outside of the meeting confirmation of any actions to be fed back to the group. Now, we can see that BT is Barry Turner. When it says SE outlined the work carried out to date in identifying possible solutions to allowing polyurethane-type insulation materials to be used in cladding systems over 18 metres, is the reference there to polyurethane correct? PUR. Is that what you meant?
I was describing the family of insulation materials.
I follow. So does that include phenolic and PI insulation?
It would do,
materials?
yes, that was it. That's
Yes, I
what it's
see.
meant to. Yeah.
Now, what was the work carried out to date?
I believe I updated the group on the work which Kingspan were doing,
And this
or
is now,
told us they were doing.
this is now December. Yes. Had you seen the results by then of the tests that were long promised?
No, we hadn't.
Did you not think to tell the BCA meeting that despite having met Kingspan in the January of that year and various meetings throughout the year, culminating in various promises being made about tests in the August of that year, you still hadn't seen them?
I can't remember exactly what I told the group. These are not contemporaneous notes. These are not a transcript of the meeting. These are high-level action points to cover what was discussed at the meeting and who had actions are leading from it.
The expression, and I appreciate what you just told me about the nature of these notes, but the expression identifying possible solutions, do you disagree that that's something you said at the time? Or
As I said, I can't remember what I said at the time. These were notes I probably made on the train on the way home.
Right. And solutions. Solutions to what? What was the problem to which these were possible solutions?
To them demonstrating compliance with the building regulations.
Right. So to allow combustible materials over 18 metres?
To provide solutions whereby builders could demonstrate compliance with the building regulations.
Wasn't it for builders to demonstrate to building control that they had complied with building regulations, as opposed to building control to identify ways for them in which combustible materials could be used at height?
As I said, the nature of the building control service is to work with those builders, and where there are routes that they can use to demonstrate compliance, to highlight them to them.
There's working with and working with those, isn't there? Would it be fair to say that, looking at the material that we've seen so far, Nhbc was, if not taking the lead on finding solutions, at least co-partnering with industry in doing so?
We were allowing industry time to be able to provide the information that they wished to provide to builders to demonstrate compliance. By this time, we were then considering our changing policy at Nhbc.
You say time, we were allowing the industry time. But did there come a time when you set a real deadline beyond which Nhbc would say, enough?
So in early 2015, we informed Kingspan that we would be going to industry to say we would only accept the use of their material in where builders demonstrated compliance using BCA Guidance Note 18, yes.
Yes. So it took 18 months between this problem first arising in August 2013 and March 2015 for Kingspan to say enough.
For Nhbc to say enough.
I'm sorry. Kingspan never said enough, I see the point. Nhbc.
It did, yes.
Yeah. Meeting with Arup. We've seen that you wrote to Brian Martin in July 2014 saying that there was no reason to suspect that buildings using K15 were at risk. I just want to ask you about some of the issues that came up in the following months after that. Can we start with NHB 50810? An email chain between John Lewis, an HBC specialist surveyor and fire engineer, and somebody from Ascent Building Control called Jane Keeley. And the date is 13th of November 2014. And I think we need to look at the top of the chain with the email from John Lewis to Jane Keeley. To paraphrase the first part of the email chain, what's happening here, to give you some context, Mr. Evans, is that Jane Keeley is forwarding an email from another colleague who is querying K15 and asking John Lewis if the LABC certificate dated November 14 is still valid. That's I'm summarising it, I hope fairly. And John Lewis's response can be seen at the top of the chain. And he writes as follows: "It's all garbage. Hereford LABC didn't know what they were talking about. We had a telephone call with LABC warranty technical manager, can't recall his name, at which he stated that they were withdrawing their approval straight away. That was on 27th of October, so I would check it's still valid if I was you." Now, just pausing there, were you on the call that was made by John Lewis to the LABC warranty technical manager on the 27th of October 2014?
I believe I was, but I can't remember specifically.
No, I mean, it's not in your statement, so I have to ask you about it.
I believe I was, but I can't remember specifically.
Right.
I know we requested a conference call with them, but I can't remember having that call.
Did you remember who you spoke to?
As I say, I can't remember. Yeah.
Now, he goes on in this email, he sets out the BBA certificate, then current, 8.2, as you can see, including the very small type next to the one in brackets, and then says, "Note that BS 8414 Part 1 is Part 1 test method for non-load-bearing external cladding systems applied to the face of the building, i.e. it's fixed directly to a masonry substrate, see Picky, If you turn the page to page 2, you can see the picky he's referring to. There is a photograph of a rig. And then he goes on at some length to explain that Kingspan have only tested to part 1 of BS 8414. And below that, on page 3, if you go to that, you can see an orange box with some yellow highlighted writing. And just let's look at that together. This is from the LABC certificate. And it says, ADB, fire safety note, from the results it can be considered as a material of limited combustibility and meets the criteria for Class 0 classification for spread of flame. Since a K15 can be considered a material of limited combustibility, it's suitable for use in all situations shown on diagram 40 of approved document B, etc., including those parts of a building more than 18 metres above the ground. He goes on to say the bit about using a non-combustible lining board instead of a masonry backing on a steel frame wall has since proved not to be correct. These words were Kingspan's. They assumed that it would perform the same, but when they did the test, it was found that it performed far worse. It's an accident. It's all an accident waiting to happen, and we're meeting with all the PIR manufacturers to try and get something sorted. But in the meantime, they continue to state that it's fine, and most BCBs accept that at face value without sifting through the details. However, DCLG are now on the case, hence why we need to sort something out soon. Now, do you know who told NHBC that? In other words...
Sorry, told NHBC what, sorry?
The bit in brackets underneath the box, the bit about about using a non-combustible lining board instead of a masonry backing. Do you know who told NHBC and what is recorded there?
No.
Was this something that NHBC building control surveyors have been seeing on their sites, namely use of a non-combustible lining board in lieu of testing on a steel frame?
I couldn't say. I didn't write this email, so I'm not sure where John got that information from.
Right. Do you know when and how John Lewis found out that the testing had shown that this build-up performed far worse, as he puts it?
No.
Just before I come back to ask you about the accident waiting to happen paragraph, can I just show you what he says above the box? If we turn up page 3, please. He says there in the second paragraph, in the second paragraph, the one at the very end of the page, Kingspan have since done at least 2 tests. I suspect they've done more, but have kept the results close to their chest because they performed so badly, using a steel frame and ventilated rain screen, and there is an issue with ongoing burning. Once the fire source is extinguished, the insulation continues to burn up the cavity, and, in one case, continued over the cavity barrier and to the top of the test rig. So it's not clear why the LABC detail states that it's an MOLC, when it clearly isn't. Now, on that, were you aware of the information that John Lewis has described?
I was aware of those tests, yes.
You were. How? How did the NHBC, how did you come to know about that?
I think we had a document from Kingspan, first of all, which put the two together, and we may have also seen the test results, the actual test results at this point as well, I'm not sure.
Right. Did that come from Ivor Meredith?
I don't know where we got those from.
Going back then to the accident waiting to happen paragraph, please, on page 3. I've read the paragraph to you, I don't need to read it again. But what he said underneath that is, our current policy is to request a copy of a test on the proposed cladding build-up. If there isn't one, then we take the view that we can't apply the BBA approval or the BRE 135 compliance. As such, it's recommended that an MOLC, MOLC, be used instead. I can elaborate further if you want. This is just the summary. Were you aware of all of those issues that John Lewis is setting out there?
They're all issues which we've been discussing as part of our work on this subject, yes.
When did what he describes as your current policy start?
This would be, at this point it wasn't a formal policy, but had a building been referred, which was by this stage obviously this is December, subject to the new BBA certificate, had one of the surveyors received a proposal, and and asked John the question in terms of around of what do we do about the use of Kingspan because it's subject to the new BBA certificate, then this would have been our stance. We were forming this policy in our mind going forward. This was all at the time we were starting to escalate it to our senior managers and to the board.
Now, you're not copied into this email, Mr. Evans. Do you think you saw it at the time?
I didn't see it until I started to prepare for this this inquiry.
Did you have any discussion about its contents, the gist of its contents, with Mr. Lewis before he sent it?
No.
Now, we know you contacted Barbara Lane of Arup on the 30th of October 2014, 3 days after the call with Nhbc. We know that. Was it this email or the points covered in it that prompted you to do that?
No.
No. If we go to NHB 500811, we can see the email you sent to Barbara Lane on the 30th of October 2014. If you go, please, down to page 4, you can see your email of that date at 11:48. And you ask for a meeting with her and the BRE.
Yes.
And you say, Dear Barbara, further to my telephone message left earlier today, I'm writing to request a meeting with you to discuss technical issues of concern to Nhbc involving residential high-rise apartment blocks where combustible materials form part of the external facade and/or the wall build-up for insulated framed building structures. The meeting would also be attended by BRE to reflect on current testing. It might help if I outline some of our main concerns below. Now, just pausing there, how did you go from believing that there was no risk, as you told Brian Martin in the 11th of July email that we saw earlier, to having a list of concerns in October 2014?
Because we hadn't received the information that we'd been promised from Kingspan.
So it was the silence, was it?
It was the continual promises and the non-appearance of the material they promised us.
Right. So just before we go to look at the list of concerns that you set out, is it right that these were concerns that you had before Kingspan, or at the same time as Kingspan, were promising you the test results, but you didn't express those concerns because you thought or hoped that the test results would address them? Is that?
I think we began to lose patience with Kingspan.
Right.
And just prior to this, myself and Graham Perrier had met with Diane Marshall and Mark Jones, who are our immediate managers, and they had, and we'd gone through the process we'd been through with Kingspan, and the suggestion was that one of the outcomes of that meeting was to go and meet with the BRE and Arups to get a greater understanding prior to us then escalating it further up to our executive committee.
Let's look at some of those concerns. If we look at the first bullet point, you say this: in looking at key aspects of design to maintain acceptable levels of fire safety over the expected life of residential buildings, we have over the past months reviewed potential fire risk where combustible construction materials are installed within external walling envelopes of drained and ventilated rain-screen facades. In focusing on an evaluation of true performance, the materials of greatest concern include PUR/PIR, thermoset rigid polyurethane board products, which are promoted by manufacturers for extensive use in external envelopes of multi-storey buildings exceeding 18 metres high. Pausing there, again, were you referring to insulation only, or were you including external cladding boards which used combustible elements or had them in it?
At this point, we were talking about insulation boards.
Going to the next bullet point, you say, in accordance with our technical standards and building regulations A, D, B compliance, Nhbc has regularly requested that fire performance should be proven by testing under BS 8414 and BR 135 requirements for high-rise buildings exceeding 18 metres. This has resulted in a greater number of these fire tests being commissioned by manufacturers in attempting to prove performance of their insulation products on facades over 18 metres. However, the results from this type testing does not always confirm the safe levels of performance that are hoped for. What testing was that a reference to?
That was referencing to the test from Kingspan.
Right. And after the bullets, the email continues at the bottom of the screen. You'll need to scroll down, bottom of the page. An internal meeting was held recently involving NHBC heads of department responsible for building control and building standards, including NHBC standards and technical. We agreed that our next course of action should be to hold initial discussions with recognised fire experts whereby issues of concern could be considered without prejudice on a purely technical basis in relation to current knowledge, including building regulations and existing standards on fire performance. We would greatly value your input and the recognised ARAP expertise concerning this particular issue. Hopefully it can help NHBC in progressing towards practical clarification on what can reliably be understood from performance testing and for potential fire engineering input regarding combustibility of insulation products and external surfaces of multi-storey facades and external walls to limit fire spread. If you would be interested in meeting, please get back to me so that we can provide some dates to arrange a meeting, possibly at the BRE Garston offices. Now, who attended the meeting that you refer to there between NHBC heads of department responsible for building control and building standards, including NHB standards and technical? Who was that?
That was myself, Graham Perrier, Diane Marshall and Mark Jones.
Now, there's a reference there to without prejudice. Without prejudice to what?
It's a phrase that it was just an open meeting in terms of open discussion.
Yes. Issues of concern could be considered. We'll just go back to the expression, please, at the foot of page 4. Issues of concern could be considered without prejudice on a purely technical basis. Whose prejudice, or prejudice to whom, did you have in mind?
I believe that wording came. I believe that wording came from our legal team at the time.
Really? Did you seek legal advice on the content of this email? I don't want to know the legal advice, but I want to know whether you sought it.
I passed a draft in front of Diane, I believe, and I don't know where that wording came from. I assumed it came from. I assume now it came from our legal team.
Do you know why the legal team was involved?
No, I don't. If I'm honest, I don't. I can't be certain that it was the legal team that put that in, but I'm not.
Now, you asked Barbara Lane if she'd be interested in meeting, and she responds the same day, only half an hour later. We can see that at the bottom of page 3, please. Steve, she says, I'm on holiday, but Jamie will call you to sort dates. ARAP are actually deeply concerned about the lack of understanding of assemblies and the ongoing incorrect use of test reports for individual materials being applied to more complex building envelope forms. The use of highly combustible materials in residential buildings is now simply an accident waiting to happen. We're getting some traction with clients, and there is definitely the beginning of a shift in emphasis. We would be delighted to address this issue with NHBC and BRE and appreciate you contacting us. Barbara. Did Barbara Lane's timely response indicate to you that she believed that this was an accident waiting to happen concern you at all?
I wouldn't say concern is the word. It again assured me that we were going to be able to move forward and meet with Arabs, and they had concerns about the product.
The accident waiting to happen was exactly the same phrase we've seen already used by John Lewis in his 13th of November garbage email 2 weeks later. Was that a coincidence, or had you fed her view back to him? We could see he was on the email chain.
I say he would have received this email, so he may have actually taken the wording from this.
Fair enough. He certainly didn't disagree, though. We can see that. Did you?
My focus is on finding a solution and arriving at a view on whether we could accept the use of this material going forward.
Yes, you've explained that. But my question was, did you think that this was an accident waiting to happen, as Arup had said?
I knew it was a solution that needed solving in order to satisfy myself that when we were issuing the final certificate, I've done all that I can under my function as a building control body to ensure that the building was safe.
Yes.
I wouldn't quite term it as an accident waiting to happen.
But Barbara Lane of Arup Fire did that not carry some weight with you?
It certainly impressed on me that we needed to do something about it, yes. Which is why we were escalating it.
Yes. I mean, there's a difference, isn't there, between a solution needing a problem needing a solution, as you'd explained, and an accident waiting to happen. There's a difference, isn't there?
There is a difference, yes.
And this wasn't, so far as Arups were concerned, simply a problem that needed sorting out. This was an accident waiting to happen. In other words, I don't need to explain to you what the phrase accident waiting to happen means, do I?
No.
You understood it at the time, I assume.
I understood her point of view, yes.
And so did John Lewis, so far as you could see.
John Lewis used that phraseology, but you'd need to address that with him.
I mean, did you think that this was Barbara Lane just exaggerating, or did you think that this was something to be taken seriously?
At this point, I hadn't met Barbara Lane, so I couldn't tell if she was exaggerating, or I didn't know if this was a terminology she used on a daily basis or what. So I couldn't pass a comment on that.
No, but to the best of your recollection of what you thought at the time, did you take it seriously that this was an accident waiting to happen, or did you dismiss it as an exaggeration?
I took this whole issue seriously. That's why I'd spent most of the previous 10 months trying to work with industry to find a solution.
Having been told by Arup Fire, as we see, that this was an accident waiting to happen, a view, it seems, endorsed by John Lewis, your fire safety engineer within Nhbc at the time, did you go back to Brian Martin and tell him that, in fact, there might well be a risk to the buildings for which you had approved combustible material in the external facade, contrary to what you said in your 11th of July email to him?
No, at this point we'd agreed to meet with Barbara at Arups, and we wanted, again, I wouldn't go back until I understood why she was saying, what she got to say at that meeting.
Right. But did you therefore have it in your mind that at some point, given the seriousness of the matter, you would have to go back to him and tell him you were wrong, and that in fact there was a real risk to the buildings in respect of which previous approvals for K15 over 18 metres had been granted?
I was aware that if we changed our position, we would go back to informing, yes.
Now, if we go please to CLG 3019264, we see that in early December 2014, and I should just say that I'm skipping over for the moment the two meetings you have with the BRE and Arup in late November 2014, just before this email. So that's potentially the context. If we go to this email string, we can see in the second email down on page 1, there's an email from Brian Martin to you on the 4th of December, and it picks up, if you go to page 2, on the August correspondence between you. So this is the next email in the chain between you and Brian Martin after the August correspondence. And if you go to page 1 at the foot of the page, you can see that in his email of the 4th of December 2014 to you, he says, "Hi, Steve, this subject," this is at the very foot of the screen, "this subject came up again recently." And then over to page 2, "Do you have any more information you can share? I couldn't find a BCA note online. Regards, Brian." And going up to your response, above that on page 1, please, you say this: "Hi, Brian, I have a BCA meeting on Monday and should be able to come back to you with a response after that meeting. I've checked the BCA website and it hasn't been placed onto it yet. I've chased and it will hopefully be put online early next week." Now, at that point, you'd had your meeting, I think, with Arup, yes?
Yes.
Was there anything in that meeting, and we'll come to the detail of it in a moment, which led you to think that, contrary to what Barbara Lane had given you by way of reaction in her earlier email, this wasn't an accident waiting to happen, and that there was no current risk?
I think at this point we'd decided that we needed to change our policy on the acceptance of K15, and we were preparing to do that.
Why did you not mention to Brian Martin here, given that you were now in contact with him and he was asking you questions, why did you not mention to him here what you had learnt about the true position in relation to the risk of combustible materials in high-rise residential buildings?
As I say here, I had a BCA meeting on the Monday when I would update the BCA group, and also internally we were then working on our changing policy. So at this point it wasn't appropriate to go back to Brian and telling what we were intending to do as Nhbc, because we were still developing that internally.
Now, the meeting, that's the BCA 8th of December meeting, which you chaired, the note for which we just saw. Is that right?
Yeah.
I see. In fact, it's right that you didn't go back to Brian Martin after that meeting and didn't go back to him at all until the 2nd of April 2015. That's what we see from the documents. Does that accord with your recollection?
It does, yes.
Yes. So you didn't then relay back to him the view that both Arup and John Lewis were of the view that the presence of K15 in a number of buildings above 18 metres was unsupported by any test data and, in their words, was an accident waiting to happen. You didn't tell Brian Martin that.
I didn't know.
Why didn't you, having previously assured him in July 2014 that there was no reason to think that the use of K15 over 18 metres posed any risk?
At this point, we were then looking to change our policy internally, and we wanted to inform. It wasn't. I was feeding up in terms of advising our managers in terms of a change of policy. It wouldn't have been appropriate at this point to go back and tell him that until we changed our policy, which we did in April.
Do I? Right. So the 30th of October 2014, we see the email from Barbara Lane. There's then some discussion about meeting, and then a meeting, in fact, took place on the 25th of November 2014.
Did.
Yes. Were you waiting to see what they said in detail at that meeting before acting on the trenchant warning from Barbara Lane that this was an accident waiting to happen?
We wanted to understand from both BRE and from Arups what their view was.
Yes. Now, so far as we can see from the documents, the meeting with Arup took place on the 25th of November 2014, and then there was a separate meeting with BRE 2 days later at Garston on the 27th of November 2014.
Yes. The original intention was to hopefully meet with them both together, but unfortunately we weren't able to make those dates work.
Was that a diary problem?
It was a diary problem.
Right. Now, notes of both of those meetings were sent to you by John Lewis on the 10th of December 2014. So that's 2 days after the 8th of December BCA meeting we saw. Let's look at those. They're at NHB 50829. And let's look first at the top of the email and the notes relating to the meeting with Arup on that day. The email covers both meetings. Pages 1 and 2 cover the meeting at Fitzroy Street with Arup Fire. In attendance, you can see Barbara Lane and Charlotte Roban of Arup, John Lewis and you from NHBC, together with Graham Perrier and Dave White, also from NHBC. And looking at the numbered paragraphs of the points from the meeting, it says, AF, that's Arup Fire, stated that they had been approached by Kingspan to offer an opinion about the use of Kingspan K15 on high-rise buildings. However, AF did not wish to be involved with only one manufacturer, but rather wished to see the issues tackled across its entire section of the construction industry. Now, just pausing there, was this the time when you first learnt that Arup were not, in fact, preparing an assessment report as had been indicated by Kingspan in early August 2014 at your meeting with them?
It was the first time we'd had direct information from Arups that they'd been approached and they weren't doing anything, yes.
Right, so Kingspan never came back to you and told you Arups had refused?
Not that I can recall.
What did you think when you were told?
I think what they said was, I don't know if it was at this point, but they certainly informed us at some point that Arups, and then were considering, or they considered that Arup were willing to sponsor a PhD student with them,
right,
to look at these issues.
Now, the assessment report that's referred to there, well, it's not referred to in terms, but the concept of an assessment report to which Kingspan had referred in August. Was that the report that you had described to Brian Martin in your 15th of August 2014 email as the assessment detailing the conditions that any cladding system should provide to allow K15 to be used over 18 metres without further justification? You'll remember the text of that email. Was that the report that you were referring to?
Well, this obviously the email to Brian was confirming what Kingspan had told us they were going to be asking Arups to do. This confirmed that Kingspan had made an approach to them about the use of their material on the buildings. It didn't confirm, obviously, what Kingspan had asked them to do, but as I say, it just confirmed that what Arup Fire had responded back to them.
Yes. What was your?
I'd putting two and two together, I would assume they're one and the same. Yes.
Yes, exactly. What was your reaction upon hearing that, in fact, that report had not been prepared and would not be prepared?
Well, the fact that it hadn't arrived with us by this point, and we were now meeting with Arups, I think we'd reached a point where we didn't expect to see it anyway.
After the meeting with Arup, did you contact Brian Martin to tell him that there would now be no Arup letter or report after all, despite what you had said? Why is that?
As I said, we were then changing our policy in terms of the use of combustible material. So we were developing that internally, and that wouldn't result in this report. So
why not keep Brian Martin abreast of what was going on, given that he had asked you to do that back in July, in fact, and again in August?
Probably because after these meetings, I was then involved in making arrangements for the changing policy.
Going on with the note, too, AF are deeply concerned about the use of combustible components within external wall constructions of high-rise buildings. AF feel that the current guidance is not sufficiently robust. AF wish to create new guidance based around bands of building risk and building height. AF are preparing an article for Architects Journal discussing the issues and risks. AF handed over a copy of LPC 1582, Requirements and Tests for LPCB Approval of Non-Load-Bearing External Cladding Systems Fixed to and Supported by a Structural Steel Frame. AF consider this to be the level of performance the wall build-up should achieve. Then 7, AF queried the position of a BCB, stating that in AF's view, NHBC BCS can insist on any level of performance they deem appropriate. NHBC SE, that's you, advised that ADB2 is deemed to satisfy requirement B3, and said legally NHBC cannot require any increased level of performance. AF stated that they would be interested in working more closely with NHBC to establish new acceptance criteria. And then you see summary, and then over the page as follows. It was felt by NHBC that AF were looking at the issue from a risk-based fire engineering perspective. Whilst laudable, this didn't assist from a BCS perspective, where acceptance criteria is already published within ADB2, BS 9991 and BR 135. NHBC feels that the current position is that systems need to be assessed according to the criteria of BR 135, this being the performance criteria issued by CLG. Now, I've read that all to you, but let's see if we can summarise what can be taken away from the meeting according to this note. Do you agree, to the best of your recollection, that you discovered at this meeting with Arup Fire, first, that they shared your concerns about the use of combustible insulation above 18 metres?
Yes.
Yes. And second, that they believed that the guidance was inadequate?
Yes.
Yes. And thirdly, that they were essentially planning on doing the same thing that NHBC had done through BCA, namely to produce guidance for industry, but admittedly rather tougher.
Yes.
Yes. And although Arup wanted to increase the level of performance above and beyond the guidance as it then stood in ADB, the NHBC did not want to do that.
NHBC, BCS were unable to do that.
You say unable to do that?
As a building control body, we can only enforce the minimum requirements of the building regulations. Arups were proposing a higher standard.
So you were pressing, is this right, not only to, well, I say pressing, you were content to work with the regulatory regime as it was, and within the regime to find ways of helping your builder customers to comply with it?
As a building control body, that's all I can work within. I can only work within the regulatory framework which is in front of me.
Why didn't you see this as an opportunity to work with Arup to toughen standards and call the likes of Kingspan to heel?
As a building control body, that would be beyond my powers to do. I can only work within the regulatory framework I have.
You had an in with the DCLG through Brian Martin. Why not go to Brian Martin and say, we think that it's time you looked closely at the regime here because, as we understand it, we're stuck with the standards in approved document B. Arup think they're insufficient and unsafe. Please release us from this bind and allow us to work with Arup to toughen standards across the industry. Why didn't you do that? We know you didn't.
We didn't.
No,
We're a
why
building
not?
control body and we have to work within the regulations we have. There would be opportunities to raise this, as there has been since in terms of when DCLG or MHCLG asked for calls for evidence in terms of revising ADB. This was one of the issues we put forward as part of that call for evidence.
Now, we'll come back in a moment to your answer about legally we couldn't, which you make in a number of places. But before I do that, can I just ask you about the reference to LPS there, or LPC 1582, which you see, I think we've lost it. It's on page 1. If we go back to that, item 6. Were you familiar with LPC 1582? It has a
No.
very long and forbidding title, but were you familiar with it?
No, I wasn't.
You weren't. I'll tell you what it was. It was called the Red Book. Have you ever heard of the Red Book?
I have.
Yeah. It was published by BRE Global in 2014 and required a higher level of performance of external cladding systems for use by insurers and other bodies. Were you not familiar with it?
I wasn't, no.
Right. Did you not know, therefore, that it was a tougher standard? It imposed a tougher standard than ADB, in that, in summary, the test periods were longer, there were more criteria, in that they included criteria for mechanical performance, burning debris, and pool fires, and glowing combustion, all of which are absent from BR 135. Did you know that?
I didn't understand all of that. I knew that it was a higher standard than was required
Yeah.
under the building regulations.
Yes. And Arup wanted the NHBC as a private building control body to insist on those higher levels of performance when providing building control services. Is that a fair summary of the attitude they were taking?
They were of the view that we could, as a building control body, ask for a higher level of
Yeah.
standards, a higher level than the building regulations required, yes. I don't know if that was specific just to NHBC or whether it's to all of building control, but they were certainly of the view that we could.
Yes. Now, when you say legally NHBC can't require an increased level of performance, is that right? That was your view of the law, was it?
It is the law as a building control body.
Let's look, please, at NHB 403452. What I'm going to show you is the witness statement of Graham Perrier of the 10th of November this year. Now, he was in charge of standards and technical, wasn't he, at NHBC?
He was, yes.
In 2014, yes?
Yes.
Yes. Page 6, please, paragraph 28. He says there, I was primarily involved with NHBC standards, of which technical requirement R1, or the standards, 2017 edition, states, work shall comply with all relevant building regulations and other statutory requirements relating to the completed construction work. NHBC will generally accept work that accords with relevant building regulations, building standards, and supporting documents. Exceptions would be where NHBC has a higher standard. Now, that's the 2017 edition. Did the edition of the NHBC standards in use in 2014 also say exceptions would be where NHBC has a higher standard?
I would imagine so, yes. I can't.
Was that?
I don't know the standards, NHBC standards inside out, but yes, I would imagine it did, yes.
Was it not the case that, in fact, if NHBC so chose, it could require an increased level of performance?
NHBC, the insurance company, in setting its standards, could, if it wished to do that. NHBC Building Control Services could not. and in respect of fire safety, NHBC standards accepted compliance with the building regulations as the level that it would expect in order to meet NHBC standards.
I see. So just help me then with the text here. The NHBC standards, are those the warranty standards which those underwriting would apply?
NHBC standards are standards which the builder, under the terms of registration, agrees to build in accordance with in order to be offered or to gain access to build mark warranty, yes.
Build mark warranty.
Yes.
So what relationship is there or was there between NHBC standards on the one hand and the acceptance criteria by Building Control Services on the other?
So requirement R1, as Graham has alluded to there, states that work shall comply with all relevant building regulations and other statutory requirements relating to completed construction work. So that is the relationship. So the starting point for compliance with NHBC standards, the minimum standard is the minimum standard of the building regulations. Where it chooses to, NHBC standards in some areas do expect a higher standard, but not, as we covered earlier in my information to the inquiry, on fire safety. So in fire safety, compliance with the minimum standards of the building regulations is deemed to then meet NHBC standards.
Sorry, I'm a bit confused. Could you just tell me, the exceptions where NHBC could apply a higher standard, you say that applies to the insurance part of the business, but not the building control part of the business?
Where NHBC standard sets a higher standard, yes.
Right. Okay. What was then to stop NHBC warranty, that part of the business, going along with Arup and working with Arup, where it could set higher standards?
If it chose to, there would have been nothing to do that.
No, exactly. So why didn't it?
NHBC was of the view at that point that compliance with the building regulations, that was our, certainly from a building control services point of view, we were working to the minimum standards of the building regulations.
Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I was just about to suggest it might be. Good, thank you very much. We'll have a break, I think, Mr. Evans, and we'll come back, please, at 20 to 4. And as before, please don't discuss your evidence with anyone while you're out of the room. Thank you very much. Twenty to 4, please. Thank you.
with BRE. Can we go back to the notes of the meetings we saw in the email, NHB 50829, and this time go to page 2. And here we see on page 2, that immediately underneath the notes of the Arab Fire meeting on the 25th of November, we see the notes of the meeting with BRE in Watford on the 27th of November 2014, 2 days later, and we can see who was in attendance. From the BRE, there was Sarah Colwell, Steve Manchester, and Steve Howard, and from NHBC, there was John Lewis, you, Graham Perrier, and Dave White. Now, I don't want to go through everybody on that list, but is it correct to say that Sarah Colwell went through the BS 8414 testing and gave a summary of the BR 135 classification, if you look at point 1?
Yes.
And looking at point 9A, if you turn the page, please, to page 3, SC clarified the following. The wording of paragraph 12.7 of ADB2 includes all major components of a cladding system, including the external finish. Now, assuming that this note is correct, what did you understand Sarah Colwell to mean by that? That 12.7 includes all major components of a cladding system, including the external finish.
All of the facade.
So would that apply to an ACM panel?
Yes, it would.
Including its core?
Including its core.
Did you understand that that meant, particularly given the reference there to 12.7, that the external cladding panel had to be a material of limited combustibility?
Well, this was Sarah's view in terms of the meaning of 12.7. That's what she understood it to mean. But my understanding was that she was referring to all of the cladding system.
Yes. Did it come to this, that you understood her to mean that the external cladding panel had to be a material of limited combustibility in order to meet 12.7?
I understood her that was her interpretation, yes.
Yes. And that included the core as well, yes?
My understanding was that her interpretation was it was all of the facade system, yes.
Yeah. Do you know what prompted her to make that clarification?
I can't remember.
Can you recall?
It would have come as part of the conversation we were having at the time.
Do you remember anything about what gave rise to it?
No, I don't.
Right. Had the NHBC been implementing that approach in practice and requiring that all external cladding panels had to be materials of limited combustibility?
I think we spoke about this before, so yes, it would be part of our assessment.
And since what date had that been the approach of the NHBC?
That would have been the approach since the requirement was in the building regulations.
Right. So is this right, that the approach of NHBC was always that all panels conforming a rain screen on a cladding system had to meet 12.7?
My view, had I been asked for advice, was that, yes, as I say, we didn't have any specific written guidance on that until we adopted BCA Guidance 918.
Yes, and so therefore when Sarah Colwell clarified the following, as this note said, she was telling you at least something you already knew.
It was telling me that my interpretation was the same as hers.
All right.
Sarah didn't write the building regulations, of course. They're written by MHCLG. So this was purely and simply Sarah's interpretation of the building regulations as it was mine.
Yes. I know it's not your writing. It's John Lewis's writing, and I know it's not your interpretation of what she said, but why was there a need for clarification of that?
I think when we were discussing the building regulations, the requirements of it, it would have come up as discussion. So again, this is not a verbatim account of the meeting. It's a list of salient points from that meeting.
Now, we saw BCA Technical Guidance Note 18, Issue 0, Option 1, published in the June of 2014 before this meeting at the BRE in the November of that year. We've seen that. I'm not going to take you back to it, but you'll recall the words materials of limited combustibility for all elements of the cladding system above and below 18 metres, and that including the external facing material. You'll remember that, yes?
I do, yes.
Yes. So is it right that the NHBC, through the BCA guidance note, was promoting the use of materials of limited combustibility in all elements of the cladding system, including the external facing material, not only insulation materials within the system, at least from June 14.
If you went down the route of option 1, yes.
Yes, if you went down the route of option 1. And that would include the cladding panels and their core,
Yes.
not simply the aluminium surface.
Not simply the aluminium surface, yes.
Yes.
Well, the aluminium surface is Class O. That's not a material of limited combustibility.
Yes. So do you know whether Sarah Colwell was giving the clarification based on what Technical Guidance Note 18 issue naught already said, or was this her coming to this separately? Or don't you know?
I don't know. No, I don't know, sorry.
Now, in your guidance note, and again, I don't need to take you back to it, but where it refers to option 1, it refers to a definition of a MOLC, a material of limited combustibility, by reference to table A7 of approved document B. Do you remember that?
I do, yes.
Yes, I don't need to go back to it. A7 of approved document B sets out both national and European testing standards which are relevant to whether a material can be considered as one of limited combustibility, doesn't it?
Yes.
And so in general terms, did that mean that cladding panels, in order to be materials of limited combustibility, had to satisfy either BS 476 Part 11 or be of A1 or A2 Euroclass classification?
That would have been without referring back to the table in detail, yes.
Yes. So is this right? According to BCA Technical Guidance Note 18, an external panel which achieved a Class B Euroclass rating, unless it had been successfully tested as part of a full-scale system test under BS 8414 and classified to BR 135, was not acceptable on a building over 18 metres.
In order to satisfy option 1, that's correct. Yeah.
That's correct, is it?
Yeah, it's correct, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I would have, yes, that would have been my...
Yeah.
If a builder had come to me and asked for that advice, yes, I would have advised them that.
And how, if that question had been asked of you, would you have squared that with 12.6 of approved document B and diagram 40, which does no more than allow Class B, which is not MOLC, material of limited combustibility, for the external surface?
So our interpretation was that all of the wall should have been a material of limited combustibility. An interpretation you could take, and I say, and this we'd been approached, we'd had that approach. Indeed, I discussed it with a number of builders. Was that you could go for a Class 1 surface spread of flame on the panel, and then the rest of the panel you could, in theory, not be a material of limited combustibility. But our interpretation was that you would need that. All of the facade systems should be a material of limited combustibility.
If it was a material of limited combustibility, then it would automatically be Class 0, wouldn't it?
It would fit. Yes, it would. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, you would tend to expect to. Yeah, it would be.
But not Class B.
You're getting into the depths of fire engineering, which would be on my area of expertise.
Well, maybe that's the problem. But I mean, I just want to see how far we can go with it with you. Did you ever address your mind to how your interpretation of the building regulations, and I'm not putting to you whether it's right or it's wrong, but how it was consistent with the provisions of 12.6 and diagram 40, which allowed Class B for the external surface?
So that's the external surface, which is the surface spread of flame, which is different from it being a material of limited combustibility.
Yeah. Did you address your mind to how that all fitted together at the time?
My interpretation had always been that the whole cladding system. So I could see where others had come to that conclusion, and indeed I'd highlight, as part of our information that we passed back to MHCLG when they did the call for evidence on ADB, we address that anomaly in there, that an interpretation of the regulations on that was that you could take that route.
When was that?
That would actually, be after the Grenfell fire.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Now, What was NHBC's policy about Class B cladding panels, or any cladding panel that was not A1 or A2, or had met 476 Part 11?
We would ask that to go down the option 3 route.
I see. So you wouldn't have accepted it,
Not that I'm aware of, no.
even though Diagram 40 permitted it?
Even though Diagram 40 permitted it.
Right. Isn't that an example of NHBC, in fact, seeking to hold builders to a higher standard of safety than ADB required? In other words, Class A1 or A2, or 476 Part 11, as opposed to Class B?
It depends how you regard 12.7 when it refers to fillers.
Was that a point in your mind, historically, when refusing to accept panels unless they were A1 or A2?
It wasn't a consideration. If you like, the focus at the time when we were doing this was around the insulation. It wasn't on specifically the panels as well. In my mind, panels needed to be, if they were going down the option 1 route, needed to meet materials of limited combustibility.
Yes.
It wasn't anything different to that. I would have urged them to go down the option 3 route.
Did any customer ever come to you and, in response to your refusal to accept a Class B panel for rain screen under the linear route and complain that you were holding them to a higher standard than required by the building regulations?
I can remember one conversation I had with Barratt East London, I believe, on a project where I met in the early stages of their design. I met with them and their fire engineer, H&H, in their offices in London.
And we'll come to that.
Yep.
We'll come to that in due course, certainly. So that's the one occasion.
It's the one occasion I can remember.
But did it occur to you at any stage that you, the NHBC, in refusing Class B panels as rain screen, was holding customers, builders, to a higher standard than that required under ADB?
It didn't, because I'd always had that interpretation.
Going back to the notes of the meeting, if we can, on the screen, if we look at them, can we look at point 10? SC recommended document LPS 1582 as a more onerous benchmark for use within the insurance industry. Now, by reference there to within the insurance industry, what did she mean, or what did you think she meant?
So generally, the insurance, sometimes within the insurance industry will ask for a higher standard, and that's based on property protection rather than the life safety. So the building regulations is about life safety, so the minimum standards are for life safety. There are several documents produced by various bodies which the insurance industry would then use, which require higher standards, and that's generally around property protection.
So would you have understood her reference to the insurance industry as including your build mark warranty?
No, because our policy is about the protection of the home. It's not about that property protection as such in similar way to this. So it doesn't cover, for example, the loss of the asset. That would then be a home insurance, a company's insurance. That's a different thing to our structural insurance warranty.
It's right, I think, as we've now seen, that by late November 2014, two significant figures within the fire engineering community, Barbara Lane and Sarah Colwell, completely independently of each other as it seems, Mr. Evans, are recommending LPS 1582 as the benchmark that's used by industry rather than ADB. Now, having it been recommended to you twice within 2 days, did the NHBC consider that proposal further?
I didn't, no.
Did anybody else at NHBC, to your knowledge?
To my knowledge, no.
Why is that?
I don't know, you'd have to ask them.
I'm asking you, so far as you know.
I was concerned from a building control services point of view, which was interested in enforcing the minimum standards of the building regulations. In terms of generation of NHBC standards, that was dealt with by Standards and Technical.
Right. And did Standards and Tech not take this point up, given that Graham Perrior was there at the meeting, and at least consider whether this higher standard should now be incorporated into the warranty?
So as I said, these standards are generally there for property protection. So this would be in the realms of, so when you have a build mark warranty, you would also take out house insurance. to prevent from accidental damage and things like that. And if your house burned down, that's insensitive. If your property was to collapse for a structural failure, for example, that would probably be for an accident, so something driving into it or something like that, an impact which caused it to collapse. You would claim on your house insurance for that rather than go to your build mark warranty. The build mark warranty it covers defects in the build that cause damage to the property, not by that external. And these property standards, the LPS standards and others that are generated for that, are about protecting the asset and the protection against that. So I think perhaps Mr. Ewing used the phrase, the example last week of a warehouse, where you've got the compartmentation wall between the warehouse, between the offices and the warehouse itself. Building regulations may require that to be 2 hours. The insurance company may require that to be 4 hours to protect the asset, the stock and things like that. So that's where those standards come from. So it wouldn't be appropriate necessarily for NHBC build mark to go along those lines.
Now, under point 10, we can see the heading summary, which says, NHBC welcomed the clarifications by BRE as well as the useful background which led up to the publication of BR 135. NHBC was unaware of the existence of a BR 135 classification certificate. Now, I just want to understand that last sentence. Was it the case that until this meeting, NHBC were really not aware of the existence of or a need for a BR 135 classification in general?
No, this was one of the questions that was asked was who could produce that classification certificate. So would it be produced by the test house or would it be produced by somebody else? Because BR 135 is a publicly available document, so it could, conceivably, we could do the BR 135 classification as a building control body. We wouldn't do that, but conceivably we could. So I think we would. It was the clarification that certainly BRE could be commissioned to both do the test and then do the BR 135 classification certificate.
What were you unaware of? What was the NHBC unaware of when it says the existence of a BR 135 classification certificate?
I can't be sure now, going back to that. Sorry.
I mean, let's be clear. Was it aware that until this meeting you weren't aware of the need for BR 135 classification at all, or that you were unaware of a particular classification certificate for something?
Sorry, we were aware that it needed to meet the requirements of BR 135. So we were aware of that. We were aware of BR 135. We were aware of the fact that in order to meet the building regulations, it needed to meet the performance criteria within that.
Right.
It was the fact that we could rely, from memory, and it is a distant memory, sorry, it could be around the fact that there could be a BR 135 certificate to prove that would be issued by the testing house.
I'm not sure I'm following. What is it? Given that you knew of the existence of BR 135 criteria, presumably from the publications, what is it that you were unaware of? It says you were unaware of the existence of a BR 135 classification certificate. What document were you unaware of?
So you can get we can be provided with a certificate which verifies that somebody has done the the classification against BR 135. So that's
yes.
been done.
Were you saying you'd never seen one for any product, or were you saying you'd never seen one for Kingspan K15, or were you saying you were unaware of the existence of the procedure for generating them? What was it you were ignorant of?
I'd never seen one for Kingspan K15, no.
No, well, you wouldn't have done at that point because there wasn't one. But what were you not aware of? I'm just trying to understand what it was you were missing.
I can't recall now.
All right.
I can't recall.
Now, looking at the heading under the summary, action following the meeting, it says this: NHBC discussed its position and determined that from a BC point of view, there is no requirement to limit/prevent the collapse, partial collapse, or falling of debris from an external wall construction during a fire situation. These matters are mentioned in various other British standard documents and so are a matter for the building design team to take into consideration when such other documents are being applied. And just pausing there, BR 135 was not a British standard, was it? But you had been made aware, I think, of the BRE, if not before that the risk of collapse, partial collapse, and falling debris was something that was required by BR 135 and therefore, by reference, approved document B. Is that right?
No, it's something that which needs to be considered by the designer. It's not necessary to attain a BR 135 classification.
Right. Why was it something that NHBC did not feel that it was something they should take into account?
Again, that's beyond the realm, beyond the need of the minimum standards of the building regulations.
But had you not been told that it was something that which needed to be taken into account?
It's something that needs to be taken into account by the design team,
Yes.
but not in order to achieve the minimum standards of the building regulations.
Were you aware at this time that collapse and falling debris in a fire situation could start secondary fires and was a relevant risk on buildings over 18 metres?
I was aware that when a building burns that you do have falling debris, yes.
Looking at the last action following the meeting, it says, NHBC followed up its meeting with BRE, but with an email, copy enclosed with this email to Dr. Sarah Colwell, clarifying what it feels its position from a BC point of view. NHBC has drafted a revision to the BCA guidance note, use of combustible cladding materials on residential buildings, and requested SC to advise of any inaccuracies. A response to this email is currently awaited. Now, the email itself we can then go to. It's NHB 50830. And this is from John Lewis to Sarah Colwell. And we can see he says there, hello, Sarah. This is the 4th of December, so a few days later. Copy to you. Hello, Sarah. Thank you for the opportunity to meet last Thursday. Since our meeting, we've continued our discussions on fire performance of insulation products within building envelopes. I think that we all found the meeting at BRE valuable in many respects, and in particular, you helped us to understand the importance of looking for a BR 135 fire classification report soon after the final BS 8414 Part 2 fire test report has been issued. Today, we've been discussing correct interpretation of the BR 135 classification report in relation to building regulations compliance. Now, does that not tell us that at the meeting, Sarah Colwell educated you on the need for a BR 135 fire classification report?
As I said, my understanding was there was a report available. My question at that meeting was who does it? And how long does it take? Because again, we'd been told by Kingspan that they had the test results, but they were still awaiting the BR 135. So there was a separation in time there. So this was all part of a learning around this issue.
Yes. And was part of the learning around this issue that before the meeting with Sarah Colwell, you had been unaware of the need to look at a BR 135 classification report, but as a result of the meeting, she enlightened you, and after that you understood the need to look at a BR 135 classification report in order to understand the test results?
No.
No?
No, I knew of BR 135, and one of the questions I said that at the time I had was who would produce that BR 135 assessment? Could we do it? Should we be doing it ourselves, or?
Right. Just help me. In the second line of that email that you received by copy, it says, in particular, you helped us to understand the importance of looking for a BR 135 fire classification report soon after the BS 8414 Part 2 fire test report has been issued. What was it that you had not understood about BR 135 fire classification reports that she assisted you to understand?
Well, actually, BRE were quite clear that they would produce the report and the BR 135 classification report together. And we'd recounted to them the fact that we had a report, we had reports from Kingspan, but hadn't had the BR 135. So,
right. Do you know whether a response to this email was ever obtained?
I don't think it was. I think there was a chase email sent, but I don't think we ever received a response.
Right. Do you know why not?
I don't know.
Now, after the meeting with Arup, 25th of November, BRE, 27th of November, did the NHBC make any changes to its approach to the acceptability of combustible insulation materials on buildings over 18 metres?
Yes, we did in February 2015.
Right, that's the next step.
Yeah.
We'll come to that. Before we do, can I go back to Technical Guidance Note 18 and Option 3? And I'd like to start with this, please, by looking at your witness statement at page 66, paragraph 185. You say there, in my view, any report for this third option needs to justify any discrepancies between the tested and proposed build-ups. In presentations I gave on behalf of BCA, I emphasised that applying data from very dissimilar materials could lead to inaccurate conclusions. In instances where we saw that occurring, NHBC would not accept that assessment. Are you able to give us some examples you came across in these reports where data was applied from dissimilar materials, or very dissimilar materials?
I can't, because in the ones I saw that were escalated to me, obviously they were at a point where John Lewis was happy to recommend that they were accepted.
So you didn't see the ones he rejected?
No, we'd have discussions sometimes about one-to-ones and things like that, about things he'd seen, but no, I didn't see those reports, no.
So in presentations, you were working on essentially what you'd been told by John Lewis, namely that there were dissimilar materials which produced data which would lead to inaccurate conclusions and so should lead to rejection.
I was emphasising that the test report should consider as similar materials as possible, yes.
Did you ever become concerned that whoever was producing the desktop reports was applying data in ways which have no scientific basis?
My concern with some of the Option 3 reports was that that we would get a view of the fire engineer not based on test information. So, to paraphrase it, they were just saying it complies because I'm a fire engineer.
So an unreasoned report?
An unreasoned report.
Right. Just standing back from that for a moment, were you aware of whether there was any framework of rules, principles, any kind of guidance about how these assessments ought to be carried out by the relevant fire engineer?
No.
Did you ever become concerned about the absence of such framework, principles, guidance?
I relied on the professionalism of the fire engineers in making that assessment and making the statements they made based on the test evidence.
Did it occur to you that one fire engineer might apply one approach, one set of principles, and another fire engineer, equally qualified, might apply another?
That's why we set up an internal review process where our fire engineers would review them internally. And yeah, you may find that a fire engineer takes a different approach to others, but providing their reasoning is based on test results, there's no reason why you can't, and it's a reasoned argument, there's no reason why you can't accept that. In a similar way to the way you find structural engineers will design buildings differently.
Now, you mentioned a moment ago that you had concerns about unreasoned reports. And you indeed cover that at paragraph 190B of your statement at page 169. I don't think there's a need to look at that, given what you just said. When was it that your concern over Option 3 desktop studies began?
When John relayed to me that some of the standard that initially was being sent through.
When was that? Do you remember?
I would imagine it would be sometime after we changed our policy in March 2015 and we started to see an increased number of Option 3 reports coming through.
And how often was it that you saw Option 3 reports which simply stated that a build-up was satisfactory without a proper assessment of or identification of the underlying test data?
Again, I can't give you that answer because they wouldn't have been escalated to me.
In circumstances where that happened, was it your understanding, although you may not have seen them, that there simply wasn't enough test data for Option 3 reports to be reliably produced? Or was it as a result of the lack of competence or expertise on the part of those producing the reports? Or perhaps both?
I would have probably thought it was on the competence area.
Right. Competence. So
In terms of the fire engine, accepted principles in doing a desktop assessment would be that you would base it on test information. If a fire engineer came to us and just said, it works because I'm a fire engineer, paraphrasing what they do, I wouldn't think they're a very good fire engineer, if I'm honest. Not just understanding the first principles of doing a desktop assessment.
And so far as K15 was concerned, when issue 0 with option 3 in it was launched in June 2014, what was the test data for K15 that would enable extrapolation into other rigs? What was the test data?
At that point, there was the single test.
Did anybody ever examine the question whether that single test from 2005 with the cementitious particle board, etc., was going to be sufficient to allow extrapolation by desktop study for use in other systems? Did anybody at the NHBC address their mind to that question?
No, the consideration was that by adopting that policy, we would actually encourage industry to undertake more testing.
And as we've seen, I think, now from some of the evidence taking us to late 2014, by the end of that year, you had still seen no test data from Kingspan, which would enable a desktop to be produced other than on the test data from the 2005 test. Is that right?
They had subsequent tests, the two tests they carried out at BRE as well.
Now, we'll come back to that, I think, later, but you say there were 2 extra tests, but did anybody address their minds within NHBC to decide whether that group of tests which had come from Kingspan and the results of it were now enough to be able to allow a fire engineer to extrapolate to a decision about whether they would meet 135 in respect of a different external wall build-up?
As I said, the adoption of BCA Guidance Note 18 was to encourage manufacturers to release more test information if they had it, because we suspected that there was more test information out there, but also to encourage the industry to undertake more testing.
So sort of chicken and egg, really. Option 3 existed.
In some ways, yes, but you have to start somewhere.
Well, right. But is it right that option 3 existed as a means of stimulating the industry to provide more test data to be able to do option 3 reports?
It was a way of providing builders with guidance on how they could demonstrate compliance across a range of options. So they could choose to go down option 1, option 2, or option 3. A builder could choose that they wanted to use a system and have it tested themselves, and indeed some did. And that test data would then be available if they wanted to make it available, because they may have done it in conjunction with the manufacturer.
Yes, what I'm really seeking to get at is that at the time option 3 in issue 0 was launched in June 2014, the universe of available test data, at least for K15, was minimal.
I think it's acknowledged the fact that there was the limitation on the number of test data all the way through this.
And would it be right then, therefore, that the efficacy of option 3 would only be as good as the universe of available test data at any given time?
It would be on the judgment of the fire engineer pulling that data together, whether they had enough information in order to make an assessment.
And that would depend upon what then happened after June 2015, so far as the production of further test data was concerned.
Or the availability that was made available to them.
Would you agree? Well, let me ask you about the process of escalation. Is it right that NHBC relied on John Lewis, who was the surveyor with a degree in fire engineering, to critique option 3 reports when they came in?
Yes.
Yeah.
In the early stages, yes. Towards, we also then employed a further fire engineer to assist with that. I forget when Malik was employed. Around 2016, I believe.
Yes, it's later. And then he would review them, and then they would be escalated to you. Was the process whereby he escalated to you those he was unhappy with, If he accepted them, why would he need to escalate them to you?
We wanted to set up. So when we instigated the new process, we put a blocking condition on all buildings that we'd assessed. So the 300 blocks that we had in construction at that time, we put a blocking condition on which prevented the issuing of a final certificate or warranty. We then set about a robust escalation process to ensure that we as NHBC, BCS and warranty were happy, because at this stage we then decided, our board decided, that actually we would have the same level of the same standard for NHBC warranty, where we were providing warranty only, as we would where we were also providing building control. So we said that we had to set up a robust escalation process to ensure that the information we gained at that time we were happy with, and that went, and it actually meant that a senior manager at NHBC had to authorise the clearance of that blocking condition.
My question to you was, I'm afraid, rather garbled. Let me try it again, despite your answer. Was the process of escalation from John Lewis to you one whereby he escalated reports he was happy with, or reports he was unhappy with?
Reports he was happy with.
Right. Why would he escalate reports he was happy with? Was that because of the block that you've just described in your last answer?
Yes.
I see. Now, with reports that he was happy with, you would then review them. What criteria would you apply to the review?
So I would generally check it for accuracy. I would have a read through the documents at high level, checking the inputs, checking very things. But I'm not a fire engineer. I was obviously relying on John's interpretation of those and the fire engineer's original report, and just looking for obvious errors, and in some cases consistency.
So you weren't, and in fact weren't able or equipped to perform a proper peer review of John Lewis's acceptance of desktop studies, were you?
No, not a fire engineering peer review. Mine was a management peer review in terms of that consistency. I'm not a fire engineer.
No. Would you agree that not all building control bodies even had the services of a fire engineer in-house to perform the role that John Lewis was performing?
That's correct, they don't.
In your experience, would most building control bodies have had the knowledge in 2014 to be able properly to critique option 3 reports that they'd been presented with, which contained much opinion and perhaps not enough test data?
That would be for the building control body to decide themselves. However, if they identified that they didn't have that fire engine expertise internally, they could, as a building control body, engage the services of an external fire engineer to do that on their behalf. And indeed, when I've worked at local authorities where we didn't have a fire engineer, we would engage an external fire engineer to assist us in that process.
Well, let me ask it differently. Did most building control bodies know that they had to critique option 3 reports that had been given with the relevant expertise in order to understand it?
Building control bodies would know that they had a duty to perform in ensuring that they fulfil their duties as a building control body, whether that be a local authority or an approved inspector.
Did all building control bodies and AIs know what the methodology was to be used in producing a desktop, so that they could check that it had been done in accordance with that methodology?
It would be up to the individual building control body to ensure the level of checking on whatever they did to those assessments.
Did they know what data they had to see in order to be able to be satisfied, as John Lewis was?
I can't speak for other building control bodies on that. I can only tell you what we expected to see as NHBC.
I mean, would you not have known that through your involvement in the BCA, for example?
As I say, I can't speak for other building control bodies. I can only refer to what we did at NHBC.
Well, it may be that NHBC was questioning substandard reports, as John Lewis was doing, filtering them out. Did you know that other building control bodies were doing the same, applying the same standards as he was, or perhaps not doing so because they didn't have the requisite knowledge?
We had some anecdotal evidence in some cases that they weren't.
No. Did you ever think that the BCA should be taking some action to set some standards to which desktops should adhere, before being accepted by BCOs generally?
I didn't, and it wasn't raised at the BCA technical group.
Do you know why not?
The BCA technical, so it's up to each individual building control body to discharge their function and for them to decide how they do that. It wasn't for BCA to tell them how to do that. The BCA was offering guidance on what level, the routes to compliance were. It wasn't for BCA to then set. The BCA wasn't a body that could do that.
Well, the BCA, maybe let's taking it in stages. You, I think, did you appreciate the risk at the time that some building control bodies might be able properly to scrutinise and critique a desktop study, and some might not, and therefore there was a risk of unevenness in standards of approach across the industry. Did the BCA appreciate that at least?
The BCA appreciated that there were differences in interpretation across the building control industry, which is why we attempted to produce guidance to aid them on various subjects. But it was still up to each individual building control body how they discharge their function.
And the BCA didn't think about producing some guidance to guide BCOs as to how to interpret desktop studies?
No, it wouldn't be appropriate for BCA to do that.
Well, the BCA had thought it appropriate to publish Technical Guidance 18, which introduced desktop studies. Given that was thought appropriate, why not BCA then thinking it appropriate to assist those reading desktop studies in a uniform way as to how to interpret them?
I'm sorry, BCA didn't introduce desktop studies. They were already there in the regulations.
Well, we've been through that. But option 3 was the first time, I think it's right to say, isn't it, that desktop studies had been put out there in the industry as a clear further alternative way of meeting the guidance in ADB and thereby satisfying the functional requirement B4.
It was the first time it had been brought together into a document covering facades.
Yes. And given that the BCA had gone that far, why was it problematic for the BCA to set out in parallel some principles for all BCOs to apply uniformly across the country, so that when each BCA picked up a desktop study, everybody knew what it was they had to look at?
Again, that would be we would have been relying on the fire engineering community to be doing reasoned desktop assessments.
Now let's
relying
turn
on their expertise.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to turn to the next topic, but I wouldn't mind making a little bit of headway on it, given where I've got to.
Well, you've got 5 minutes if
Yes.
you want to use it.
Let's see how I get on in 5 minutes.
Yes.
BC's Technical Guidance Note Issue 1, June 2015, is where we go next. And this is at CEL quadruple 02440. And for those interested in the version we used at Module 1, it's CEL 402347. If I have both of those in the transcript, people can find them. Now, you can see first page, date, Issue 1, June 2015. If we turn to page 2, option 3, we can compare. In option 3, it says, if no actual fire data exists for a particular system, the client may instead submit a desktop study report from a suitably qualified fire specialist, stating whether, in their opinion, BR135 criteria would be met with the proposed system. Now, you remember that in the 2014 guidance note, those who could produce test stops were limited to a UCAS-accredited testing body, BRE, Chiltern Fire or Warrington Fire. You remember that?
I do.
And now in the 2015 guidance note, that was amended to a suitably qualified fire specialist. Yes?
Yes.
Now, you've explained a little bit about this in your statement, which I'd like to look at. Page 73, paragraph 193. And you pick that up here under the heading, BCA Guidance Note, Issue 1. You say the BCA guidance note was subsequently reissued in July 2015. I think that's actually June, isn't it?
Yes.
It is. The 2015 BCA guidance note, A, expanded the range of methods to include a fourth option to demonstrate compliance, option 4, and B, permitted suitably qualified fire engineers to produce option 3 assessments. Now, staying with option 3 reports, can we look at page 77 of your statement, please, at paragraph 200? You say there, one of the amendments was to widen the bodies that could provide option 3 assessments. In the 2014 BCA guidance note, that was limited to a UCAS-accredited testing body, BRE Chiltern Fire or Warrington Fire. In the 2015 BCA guidance note, that was amended to a suitably qualified fire specialist. The reason for this was, A, as described in paragraph 190 above, my recollection is that BRE had stated at the meeting on 27th of November 2014 that there was an issue with dealing with the volume of option 3 requests. There were only 3 named testing houses to deal with these. My recollection is that LABC had received similar feedback. B, this change to the BCA guidance note was therefore to increase the capacity of suitable engineers to carry out the assessments. It was not reducing the criteria for compliance in any way. C, this change was consistent with the approved document B, paragraph 1, appendix A of approved document B, etc., which states, for this purpose, laboratories accredited by UCAS for conducting tests and suitably qualified fire safety engineers might be expected to have the necessary expertise as set out in paragraph 178 above. Now, first, if we go back to the note of the BRE meeting on the 27th of November 2014 at NHB 50829, let me just ask you about this, perhaps before the break. You can see there in the second half of the email, on page 2, if we go to that, we can see the BRE element. We've looked in vain for any reference there to BRE saying that they did not have capacity to deal with option 3 reports. You can take a moment to study it, if you like, on page 2 and on page 3. We can't find any reference in it. Can you?
I can't, no.
No. Do you know why it wasn't noted, if indeed BRE had said that they didn't have capacity to deal with option 3 reports?
I don't know why it wasn't noted. As I say, my recollection was that it was discussed as part of that meeting.
And you say in your statement that the change was made to increase the capacity of, quote, suitably qualified fire engineers to carry out assessments, and that the expression suitably qualified fire specialist was consistent with ADB Appendix A, paragraph 1, which referred to suitably qualified fire safety engineers.
Yes.
If that's the case, why not say fire safety engineers and simply mirror the language in approved document B for a suitably qualified fire safety engineer, who at least would have qualifications, rather than using the expression suitably qualified fire specialist?
I don't believe I would have seen them as any different. Fire safety specialist, fire safety engineer. There isn't a protected title for a fire safety engineer as there is such as like an architect. So,
well, what is a fire specialist?
A person who specialises in fire.
Well, maybe. That would include,
that isn't defined within the building regulations.
No, but it might include people who do fire risk assessments for a living, for example, or install smoke alarms.
I can see how you could read that into it, yes.
Mm. So what was the reason, then, for departing from the language of ADB Appendix A, which actually specifically referred to fire safety engineers?
At the time, I didn't see it as any different. Until you've pointed it out now, I wouldn't have even seen it as any different, if I'm honest.
Mr. Chairman, it's 4:30 and we're hanging mid-topic, but I'm happy to leave
The
it.
trouble is, it'll take quite a long time to finish the topic. And anyway, I think the day's gone on long enough.
I'm sure that's true. We can break them.
I'm sure Mr.
and we
Evans
can come
will
back
take that anyway.
tomorrow morning on the same topic.
Yeah. Well, there it is, Mr. Evans. I'm afraid we'll break that topic at no doubt a very interesting point. I think we've all done enough for one day, so we'll stop there. I'm afraid I have to ask you to come back tomorrow for some more questions, but I think you were expecting that.
I was, yes.
Yes, good. So we'll resume, please, at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. And in the meantime, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go to the usher then, please. Thank you, Mr. Millett. 10 o'clock tomorrow then, please. Okay.